Thank you very much. On Thursday, Abner and Jonathan gave us a nice description of the incredibly extensive process that they went through to select papers. And it's pretty clear it worked really well because the papers have been excellent. What I noticed is there was no discussion of how they selected discussants. Now, Konstantin, Dimitri, I understand why they're up here. I wasn't quite clear why I was up here, so I asked Jim. And he said, well, we're going to start the conference with a paper on culture. So Jillian's going to talk about that. And then we have this Swedish experiment. And in the outside chance that the Swedish culture matters for this, we want someone who might know that. And I think Petersen SCN is probably Norwegian or Danish, and that's close. What Jim didn't know is my mother's Petersen ON, so I do have the Swedish piece as well. This paper has 4 co-authors. Now, I'm sympathetic to multiple co-authors. I've got a 5, and there's a reason for it. This is a massive data collection. In fact, if you read the thank yous, there's only apparently 2 RAs that worked on this, so I'm assuming that all the data work had to be done by the authors. They're going to start with a really important question. Is home ownership good? And as he explained, lots of countries, including the US, have spent a lot of resources, financial and time on this. And over the last 50 years, the experiment in the US has been phenomenally successful. We've raised the home ownership rate from about 63% in the 1960s to last November, it was about 63%. And the range isn't that high. It runs from about 60 to 66, and if you take out the sort of run-up, it's incredibly stable. In their experiment, they're going to move it from 4 to 80% for this subset. So if you want to see an example of where this is going to matter, that's where you want to look at it. Now, before you get to that question, to argue that you should change toward home ownership, you've really got to assess what is the reason people buy or rent. Several of you rented cars to come up here. Very few of you bought the car at the airport, and then are going to sell it when you get back. We rent because it's preferences. I dislike the transactions cost of buying and selling because I'm only going to be in the house for a while. I like the bundled resources of renting because I don't like shoveling. I hate committee meetings, so the thought of going to a co-op is not my idea of fun. I dislike the risk of the equity. And if the reason you rent is that preference, then we start messing around with that. It's not clear we're creating social value, and you should see reoptimization. Second possibility, we rent opposed to we buy. We can't. I don't have the money for the down payment. I don't have the income for the monthly payment. And so part of the beauty of this experiment is it's targeted toward both of those. So they're going to set the mortgage payment plus the co-op fee equal to the subsidized rent. So if it's an income thing, that effect goes away. If it's a wealth thing, they're going to basically have the value of that house, the price at which you buy it, is going to be a discounted value of the rent. As Dean said, that means we're going to have a huge windfall. The windfall is about $715K. So that means if I'm going to relax the wealth or I'm going to relax the income, I've resolved that problem. Now, what effect this has depends on whether we think it's preferences or this constraint. And the evidence seems to suggest there's some of both. As the figure he showed, you see a huge increase in ownership from about 4 to 80% for the treated group. Then over about 5 years, it comes back to about 65. And for the untreated group, it goes from about 0% up to about 20. Some of these people are in the rental because it's transitional and they're going to buy anyway. Some of them were in the rental because for preferences they didn't want it and they're going to re-optimize back. Now there's still a huge wedge which says that constraint must be part of what's going on. To understand the strengths of the paper, there's lots to love about this paper. This experiment is beautiful. So think about the amount of literature on the effect of housing. Some in finance and economics, a huge amount that was not, and he gave a very short view of it. A lot of things have been regressed on housing, and as he said, we don't have any experiments, so you have no idea. The beauty of this experiment is, go read in the details, it's incredibly close to a random experiment in terms of what we're going to do. Second one, extensive data collection. The 4 authors and the Swedish government have a huge amount of data. And so the paper is going to run 80 pages. There is a massive number of facts that he ran through some. I'll talk about a few. That's the strength. The challenge and the focus I want to do is what does it mean? And that's where I think the next last step of the paper is going to be, is building a cohesive story to explain how you interpret it. And he showed you some of the facts. It's a little unclear to me what they mean, and so I'm going to focus on those. Now, I'm slow, so I'm going to go back to this consumption. Stated beauty of the paper is they have incredibly good data on consumption. Now, what does that mean? They know how much money I make. They know how much money I put or take out of savings, and from that, they're going to calculate consumption. Consumption is not observed, it's not a survey result, it's a calculation. So that means this is an identity. And the beauty is then everything adds up. So consumption is going to be the money coming in, income, debt increases, I'm going to spend money on housing, I'm going to spend money on financial assets. Income is wages plus dividends plus interest. There's a whole section of the paper that talks about collection of this. See, if you put money in the market and you earn dividends or you put in bonds or interest, they're going to calculate that as income and then a reinvestment. That means they have to go look at my portfolio and how much I made. You saw none of that from the presentation, but there's a huge amount. That means my savings is going to be the increase in the housing wealth, the equity stake, plus the financial assets. And so when we go look at the data, you're going to see everything add up. The challenge is how to interpret those results are. Okay, treatment effect. Before there are people that are renting that do not win the lottery. Before there are people that are renting that do win the lottery, about 715K. How does the change of behavior in the year they win it and following alter? Well, you just got a huge wealth effect. And what do you do with all your money? First thing you do is you eat less. Consumption drops 10%. Next thing you do is you work more. Wages don't go up, but number of hours go up. And you stick about $27,000 into savings. You know, if I were to get tenure or win the lottery or a raise, I'm not sure the first thing I'm going to do is quit eating and work more. So when he very subtly said, this is a little bit unusual, this seems a little inconsistent with our theory, yeah, this isn't exactly not at all what I thought. So what do? They're going to increase their equity stake by about $39,000 the house. They don't have a house yet, but they're going to buy one and they're going to put 10% down. The extra income, reduce consumption, and pull $12,000 out of your bank account, that's where you get the $39,000. Is that preferences or is that constraints? And throughout the paper, they say this is not a constraint. What does he mean by it's not a constraint? Well, you get to buy the house for $100,000, but it's really worth $103,000. So any banker you know would be happy to lend you $100,000. What I don't know is if that's a theoretical statement or an empirical statement. So as a thought, I went to my local banker and I said, I want to buy this house for $100,000. It's really worth $130,000. Could I borrow $100,000? He said no. Now, if the banks understand this, that it's really worth $130,000, they would lend $100,000, then it's preferences. If the banks or the regulators are looking at you're paying $100,000, I'm not going to lend more than the purchase price, it's a constraint. That's an easy thing that the authors have already done and I missed, or they're going to call the bankers and figure out it's a constraint or not. Let's say it's not a constraint. Then something's going on here. And this comes back to that Swedish Norwegian thing. I grew up in a house where my dad hated debt. And so if he ever got a good opportunity to buy real estate and he didn't have money, he would borrow from the bank and we wouldn't go on vacation, we wouldn't eat meat until the debt was paid back. That means I can go into the data possibly and start to flesh it out. There's one paragraph that has alternative explanations for what's going on. I think that part needs to be fleshed out because this is an intriguing fact, but not at all what I expected. Okay, the treatment effect's big. Consumption falls by about 10%. But as the paper says, remember that's the difference between the treated and the controls. Before they're the same, what causes that 16,000 drop in consumption? Actually, the treatment guys don't change their consumption much. They don't eat much less. It's the controls that increase their consumption by 60.5. And as the paper says, in the absence of winning the lottery, you would have increased your consumption. Why? What's happening in the controls? We don't have it in the data, but did the controls start going out and working a lot harder? Did they basically run down their financial wealth? Did they go borrow more against their house? I'm pretty sure it's not number 3 because they don't have a house. And so I'd like to figure out what's going on in the economy that you all of a sudden have this increase in consumption of about 10% for the guys that don't win the lottery. GDP in Sweden has grown about 3% a year over this 2-year period, so there's something else going on. Now, the favorite part of the savings consumption for me was this difference between the movers and the stayers. There's a slight issue of figuring out who the control is, and the paper talks about in the appendix. If I'm renting and I therefore get to buy a house, but then I move maybe back to renting, am I like someone that chose to go from renting to purchasing or someone that stayed as a renter? Because it's both which I'm doing as well as the direction. And in the appendix they look at, and I don't think there's a whole lot interesting empirical, but it comes back to this a constraint, or is this a choice of whether I want to rent or own? Now, what they're going to do is they're going to see of the group that will eventually move in the next 3 years versus stay, what happens. And the groups are different, but not as different as I expected. Both groups are going to cut consumption. The guys that are going to move are going to cut consumption more than the guys that are going to stay. What's interesting is if you look at the statistical significance, light blue or purple is not significant, you lose the statistical significance. It was in the individual groups together, but once you break it apart, it falls apart. That means there's a lot of variation within these groups that somehow is washing out when you put them together. Maybe it's a simple number of observations. The guys that are going to move are going to spend more time working, and they're going to ramp up their savings. They're not going to run down their financial assets as much. Now, if you knew you were going to move and this was a great opportunity, you might want to buy that house as a way to liquidate. And that's exactly what they're doing. I'm suspicious the financial assets isn't a choice. Maybe it's a constraint. But again, these guys have phenomenal data. They can look at it. What happens after you move? In the full sample, there was nothing statistically significant. When you break it apart, you do see a couple of things. I'm going to stay, and once I've done the house, I'm not going to change my income. I'm not going to change my consumption. So I drop my consumption that 1 year. I increase my income, but after that, I'm just going to continue to drain my financial assets each year. I'm going to pay down the loan. That feels like that person who really doesn't like debt, so I think maybe that's the story that's underlying. The movers, they're the ones where all the action is. They save a huge amount, and then over the next 4 years, they reverse it by more than that. Consumption, wherever they didn't eat this year, they definitely eat in the future, and they're liquidating. I was planning on moving anyway, and there's two versions of this. There's I was going to buy it and then go back to renting, and now I can eat a lot, and they can look at that. Some of these guys are going to move to other locations and actually be purchasers. And as he talked very briefly but deeply in the paper, they move to nice areas, they buy nicer houses, so this is sort of a stepping stone. That's the savings and consumption. This paper has a huge number of other results. I want to talk briefly about a couple. The job loss one was fascinating. Take the people that got the lottery and look at the ones that had a more than 20% wage fall. On average, they lost 40% of wages. Really catastrophic result. Did the fact they have a house help? Yeah, it eliminated 92% of the wage fall. So if you didn't get the lottery, your consumption dropped by $35,000. If you did win the lottery, it only dropped by $3,000. This is a really important effect. Interestingly, the stayers, it has less of an effect. The movers, it has more of an effect. That part makes sense. What's weird is it not only has more of an effect for the movers, but more than 100%. So if you're in that group that had to stay and you lose your job, your consumption drops 37%. If you were in the group that moved and you lose your job, your consumption goes up. Now maybe it's the complementary of like leisure and income. And so now that I've lost my job and I have this big wealth shock, I'm basically going to go play video games for a couple of days. Greater equity participation, greater mobility, move to nicer areas. And since Jonathan is starting to get restless, I'm going to stop at that point. This paper has an incredibly nice experiment. When you find one of these, it's awesome. It has an amazing amount of data collection. Authors deserve a lot of credit. It has a phenomenal number of building blocks or facts. The last part is just building those blocks into a cohesive story, and they've made a nice start, but there are a couple that I still don't follow.